This is lecture 4 in Introduction to Politics. I'll be looking at the role of government and branches of government in this particular lecture. When many people think of the role of government and branches of government, there is a tendency, first of all, to be skeptical, to be cynical, to distrust politicians, the bureaucracy, the bloated administrations of government. And then the very branches of government, it can be immensely confusing for people in terms of trying to make sense of it. And so the danger then is just giving up, if I can use the Aesop's fable of the fox and the grapes. The fox was rambling through a vineyard in the autumn when the grapes were at the fullest, and it saw these luscious grapes, and it leapt up to get them, but it couldn't reach them, and it tried and tried again to reach them, and it didn't. It just lacked the strength, it lacked the ability, lacked the effort, and the fox thought just by leaping up once or twice that it would get what it wanted. And when it didn't, then it went on to say the grapes must be rotten, and so why would I waste my time on them? A lot of people today are like the fox when trying to understand the role of government and the branches of government. They jump up once or twice and they think that they're going to get the complex grapes, and when they don't get it, then they start demeaning government in its structures and the systems and the bureaucracy that goes with it, rather than saying perhaps it's not the government and its branches that are the problem, it's my laziness and my lack of effort and putting in the work of trying to understand it. And it's only in that process you eventually get the good grapes, and the grapes become the wine of insight over a period of time. But there's a certain level of intellectual laziness amongst people who want quick answers to complex problems, and when they don't get it, their own ignorance and arrogance comes together to demean the grapes, as it were, or the role of government and the branches of government. So in a discussion of the role of government and the various elements of government, it takes work, it takes effort to understand, and people who don't want to put in the work, don't want to put in the effort, the danger then is they then just caricature or they demean the role of government and the very branches of government. And so often laziness, ignorance, and arrogance become a sort of a dark trinity that is very dangerous. The dilemma, of course, is that people who do that, they're constantly the beneficiaries of government, and when anything goes wrong, seriously, the government is the first to blame, but they're constantly reaping the fruits of government work, whether it's education or health care or benefits or pensions. And in the midst of the COVID crisis, again, it's the government that has stepped up and played an important, always imperfect role in terms of the role of science and medicine, the important role of funding small businesses or larger businesses that are seriously affected. It's the role of government in getting vaccines out for people. And so inevitably what happens is that for much of the time we are all beneficiaries of the government, whether it's the roads we drive or whether it's the food that goes into supermarkets, it's the healthcare system, it's education, policing that brings law and order, so many things that it provides that people just assume are to be there, and that is the role of government. But again, it takes time to understand particularly the branches of government and the role of government itself. Now, within a liberal democracy, there has been obviously a commitment to understand the role of government quite different than a totalitarian regime in which the role of the citizens is seen usually as secondary or insignificant to a dominant elite running and a certain military that oppresses dissent, or authoritarian governments which again do the same but for different reasons. Liberal democracies have tended to oppose totalitarian regimes, but often are quite willing to work with authoritarian regimes, such as, say, the First World works quite amiably with Saudi Arabia during the Iran-Iraq War, could work quite amiably with Saddam Hussein contra Khomeini in Iran, supported many Latin American dictators, Pinochet and others. And so there's often this tension in a liberal democracy between opposing totalitarian governments, but often working with authoritarian governments as the lesser of the two evils. Also, liberal democracies, in terms of roles of government, have generally moved away from monarchy. So in Canada, for example, we have a constitutional monarchy in which the monarch reigns, but obviously does not rule in this country. And so Canada has taken a position, obviously coming out of a liberal democratic tradition, as has the United States and varied European states. So the three traditions politically that they have tried to find their way forward on as where not to go are totalitarian, authoritarian, and monarch traditions themselves. So what then is the role of government within liberal democracies? Well, as much as possible, obviously, to create the possibilities of the forming of political parties, freedom of elections as much as possible. Obviously, one of the big issues that is before many today is the difference between first past the post voting and proportional representation, and these are tensions that are front and center. The role of government in providing in Canada universal health care, affordable education. We've noticed through this COVID crisis, obviously care homes and senior homes, this has been brought before the federal government again and again in terms of the tragedies which have occurred in these homes with COVID. Who's responsible for this, and who's to blame for the many deaths in the care homes? So in Canada we have obviously a government which is considered a federal tradition, and within that, just as in the United States, there's a constitution. So just in religious traditions, there are sacred books, say in the Jewish tradition, the Hebrew canon, the Bible for Christians, the Quran for Muslims. So within political traditions, liberal democracies, there are constitutions. And it is these constitutions that put together the rules for the game. So 1867, the BNA Act in Canada, that was our first constitution. Out of that we get terms like Canada is about law, order, and good government. 1982, again the Canadian Act in that sense, the Trudeau brings in, which increasingly moves us away from England in terms of its role in Canada, even though obviously we have a Governor General who represents the monarch in Canada. But out of the 1982 Constitution comes our Charter of Bills and Charter Bill and Rights. And many would argue this particular charter, as being very liberal, has excessively given more power to individuals versus the common good, communities. And so but again, the Constitution is very, very important. Canada's Constitution is very different from the American Constitution. So one of the things I mentioned as I started this course is that there are 4 areas we're going to be looking at. One is political philosophy, political theory, which I've touched on earlier. The second is Canada. Canadian politics, there's comparative politics, then there's international relations. Well, in the earlier part of this course, we'll be touching a little bit on comparative politics in terms of the United States and Canada. And our constitutions are quite different in the United States. Theirs is about life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Now, the dilemma of constitutions, like sacred texts themselves, they have to be interpreted. And it's not like somehow they're a Sinai document that people all agree upon. But in fact, constitutions can be amended. They can obviously be interpreted differently. And certainly with the Constitution of 1982, a whole range of different interpretations have emerged, particularly through the courts and the judiciary. So when we think of Canada and the States comparatively, we're a parliamentary tradition, which is very different from a presidential tradition. We're right now living through the American election, in which Trump, for example, constantly is questioning the voting, and the Trumpites are continuing to follow him on that particular track. Now, one of the reasons within a liberal democracy, you have constitutions, and you have within the functions of government or the roles of government checks and balances on power, because this was always the fear within liberal democracies of totalitarian governments, authoritarian or monarchs, is that you get a centralized authority which ignores or undermines the role of the people themselves. So a liberal democracy has tried to find as much as possible checks and balances on power. So in Canada, for example, we have the legislature, we have the executive, we have the judiciary, and then we have the civil servants or the bureaucracy. But our Senate is very different from obviously the Senate in the United States, in which people vote on. In Canada, they are appointed. A very different tradition that comes from the House of Lords or the Commons in England, in which the notion of the Senate, in which people are appointed, are meant to be people who have some historic experience, and they can contribute and be a sober second thought to decisions in the Commons themselves. And so if you have constantly a merry-go-round of a Senate, that stable force that constantly is there and is not up to voting patterns is a different understanding of the role of Senate and Commons. We also have, obviously, because we're not a republic, we have the monarch, and the role of the monarch historically, even though often seen as somewhat anachronistic, is above all to be a position that transcends partisan politics, to offer a perspective that is not ideologically driven by right or left or soft right, but offer a position that is even at its best even more substantive in England than the House of Lords or the Senate in Canada. And so in the States, this is quite different in terms of the role of the President, the Senate, and Congress in the States. So the two very different perspectives, both liberal democratic, and both different means of offering checks and balances on power itself. But because Canada, given the Westminster tradition, drew from a very different heritage in terms of the role of the monarch, the role of the Lords, the role of the Commons, and the, in that sense, balancing of powers, but also much more centralized in power. So Canada, unlike the United States, the federal government has a more prominent role to play in a whole range of national interest. And so because Canada, with its notion of a liberal principle of equality, when we have particular provinces in Canada that are not doing as well financially, we have in Canada the whole notion of equalization. So in the Maritimes, as the industry of fishing has done less and less, and you have a wealthy province like Alberta, a bumper crop province in oil. It's the role of the federal government, as much and as far as possible, to move finances around so that less prosperous provinces are funded by more prosperous provinces, and of course Alberta is none too keen on moving in such a direction. But the federal government has a role to play with the provincial government and municipality in creating a just and peaceful state, a law, order, and good government. Quite different from the United States in that way. People often, in trying to make sense of the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary in Canada, often ignore the important role of those who carry out the decisions made by the Supreme Court or other courts in terms of the day-to-day work of Canada, the bureaucracy and the civil servants themselves. And so this fourth element, when we think of the role of government, is very important, because again we inevitably, some people complain about the bureaucracy, the administration, it's top heavy, all the money through taxation that goes on to paying for these civil servants, and yet the role they contribute in Canada, because they are the permanent ones. You can have in elections in a democracy, parties come and parties go, but the civil servants, our institutions, remain stable, and this is very important to understand in a democracy, is that we can vote in parties on the right, the center, or the left, but the actual structure constitutionally, much remains the same and is upheld. And so within democracy, you obviously have elections and parties voted in, but regardless of what party comes in via our constitutions, there is a structure that remains stable. It's not as flighty as the weather or a cloud passing through, and it can't be changed easily. And so we're guaranteed through our Constitution of 1867, 1982, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, judiciary, which is constantly going to be checking previous, say, common law decisions in the courts, is that there will be a stability, and this is why, as I mentioned earlier, our first Constitution, BNA Act of 1867, law, order, and good government within Canada is upheld. Quite different from the United States, and yet both come from a liberal democratic tradition, how they operate, but they have interpreted that very, very different in how checks and balances will prevent any particular person from taking power. We can see this obviously happening across the border, and certainly the November election in the United States, and Trump and the Trumpites, and the challenging the voting, and this desperate need constantly to be in power to get his own way. But in the United States, this is constantly, he's limited in what he can do by Congress in terms of the House and the Senate. And as this transition in power takes place, in which Biden and Harris will soon be coming to power, I suspect we will continue to get Trump and the Trumpites stomping and beating their drums as they see power gradually waning. But the strength of a certain political system that honors both President, Senate, and House, the two chambers in Congress, it very much limits what someone like a Trump would like to do if we're not these multiple breaks that prevents him from unilaterally moving forward. And so liberal democratic traditions, in terms of, they consciously emerge from heritages of centralizations of power and some of the terrible injustices that can occur. But in comparing the Canadian system to the American system, we have two different understandings of how liberal democracy should work. And within Europe itself, if we compare, quite different as well, how liberal democracies, certain elements of the European tradition has a much higher role of the state in terms of social welfare and social goods and freedom of education. Canada is torn between a European model and an American model, and we constantly live in this tension between a Republican model and an older European model, one moving much more towards lighter state, more power to the individual, the other moving from a position of the common good and the role of the state and society in bringing about that good. So when we think of the role of government, we must be careful we don't be the fox who demeans government, only picks on negative stories without seeing all the good that government provides, and the very structures of government themselves that have a legislative, that have an executive authorities. There's prime ministers or presidents, whether it's a parliamentary or presidential system. And then the hard work of the bureaucrats and civil servants in Canada, which in an ongoing way provide consistent services for citizens in Canada, whether it's pensions or welfare, or employment insurance, or immigration, or passports, or health care. I mean, there's so many services provided in terms of the social welfare tradition of Canada, or the social liberalism of Canada, which is closer to the European model. But it is these civil servants who faithfully serve. Obviously, there's going to be those who abuse it, but they're a very small minority of the majority of civil servants. And so these four elements in terms of the structure of government, the legislative side, the executive, the role of presidents or prime ministers, and then those who carry out the work in terms of executing what has been, and then obviously the judiciary, the courts is very important in terms of executive, legislature, and judiciary, and then those who carry out the decisions of these three branches of government. So in thinking of government, I just would say one more thing, which I'd meant to say at the beginning. In the previous lecture, I talked about political philosophy and political theory. What was missed in both your book you're going to be reading from is that none of the Canadian political philosophers are mentioned in the book. Talk about the English tradition, Plato, well, obviously the Greek tradition, Plato, Aristotle, some of the Machiavelli, Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, French tradition, Rawls, important American liberal theory. But you think in a book that is put together by Canadians that some of our important Canadian political philosophers would be mentioned, because we have a long history of very rich political philosophy in Canada. And just to mention a few of them, obviously probably the most preeminent liberal, very thoughtful liberal political philosophy, Charles Taylor. He's won many awards for his work, and so he's in his late 80s. George Grant would embody the high Tory perspective in Canada. So comparing a George Grant with a Charles Taylor is very important understanding Canadian political philosophy, and then how that works itself out in the role of government, in the structures of government itself. Harold Innis, very key figure in understanding why Canada goes, why North America is east to west rather than north to south. Harold Innis, foundational in all of this. The role of Hegel in terms of Canadian Canada has been considered the most Hegelian state in liberal democratic traditions. So the role of Watson, one of the earlier Queen's philosophers, in terms of his role of Hegel. Michael Ignatieff, James Tully, these are important Canadian political thinkers. In terms of ecology, what role has David Suzuki played, and Wade Davis at the present times of ecological issues of grappling with these particular very legitimate concerns. Great literary figures like Northrop Frye. And so when we think in our readings, most of the political theorists that are mentioned, as I mentioned, come from the Mediterranean, Europe, or the United States. But important to recognize, Canada has a very rich heritage of political philosophy, and that political philosophy then turns into its application in terms of roles, the role of the government, and then the very structure of government itself.